Good day. We hope that you enjoyed your 2021 Emancipation Day. I am very excited that you are joining us for this commemorative panel on Virgin Islands Creole. As we explore the relationship between language, culture, identity, power, and freedom in the Virgin Islands, I am pleased to be your moderator this evening. I am Dr. Hadiya Sewer, the president and co-founder of JanCo, the St. John Heritage Collective, and I'm also a research fellow in the African and African American Studies program at Stanford University. To begin, I would like to thank everyone who made this panel possible. This event was organized by St. JanCo with support from the Friends of the Virgin Islands National Park. We are grateful to the Friends of the Park's interim director, Tonya Lovejoy, for inviting us to participate in their Community Matters series. This programming received a National Endowment for the Humanities funded grant from the Community Foundation of the Virgin Islands. I would like to thank everyone, including the staff here at WTJX, for bringing this critical discussion to life. I am very pleased to be joined by our panelists, Dr. Gilbert Sprauve, Dr. Clement White, and Mr. Biko McMillan. Dr. Gilbert Sprauve is a monumental scholar, griot educator, and folklorist from St. John. Dr. Sprauve earned his BA from Boston College and his PhD in sociolinguistics from Princeton University. Dr. Sprauve is a former Virgin Islands senator, a professor emeritus at the University of the Virgin Islands, and the author of several books, including Pell Mell, So We Live, Soundings Over Cultural Shoals, and Andanzas Bajo el Sol. Dr. Clement White is the son of Marjorie White Stevens. He was raised in Savannah and Paul Pearson Gardens, i.e. Housen and St. Thomas. Dr. White earned his BA and his MA from Kent State University and received his PhD from Brown University, where he specialized in Latin American literature. Dr. White was a professor at the University of Rhode Island for over 30 years, and he is currently a professor emeritus at the University of Rhode Island. Dr. White authored several books and articles, including Meet Me Under the Bangolo and Talk Like We Know, A Case for Virgin Islands Creole, Then and Now, and a sociocultural lexicon of Virgin Islands Creole, as well as We Butty, a poetic journey of and in search of a West Indian identity. Mr. Biko McMillan was born and raised on St. Croix. He is the grandson of Stanley Jacobs and a cousin of D. Hamilton Jackson, thereby having history coursing through his veins. He is a graduate of Southern Methodist University, where he earned a Bachelor of Science in Biological Sciences and a Bachelor of Arts in Spanish. Biko is also a writer, having published 2 books of poetry titled Writing on Roots and Blue Period. He serves as the editor-in-chief of State of the Territory News and Kickin' It. I'd like to thank each of our panelists and the members of the community for taking the time to join us today. On July 3rd, the people of the Virgin Islands celebrated Emancipation Day, and we are continuing this commemoration with this evening's panel. In the mid-19th century, a rebellion against slavery took place on the island of St. Croix, thereby leading then Governor Peter von Scholten to emancipate the enslaved people of the Danish West Indies. We often remember John Gottlieb, General Budho, as a key leader in this bold act of resistance. It was one that upset Governor von Scholten's plan to gradually abolish slavery in the Danish West Indies. Instead, this uprising called for an immediate emancipation for the people of the Danish West Indies, rather than the gradual 12-year plan originally proposed to free the enslaved people. In formulating this panel, I was inspired by my participation in an Emancipation Day play spearheaded by Dr. Gilbert Sprauve and Ms. Rosa Samuel. It was an annual event, like many other forms of celebrations that take place in the Virgin Islands, where we commemorate Emancipation Day with works of art, most notably with plays, with songs, and with dance. One of the things that I absolutely enjoyed about my participation in the play as the Mele woman was essentially the eloquent and skillful use of Virgin Islands Creole in the script. The play pushed me to think more about how we as Virgin Islanders leverage language to remember our freedom fighters and to assert our identity as Caribbean people in a pluralistic society who are currently colonized by the United States of America. My exploration of this topic is supported by Drs. Vincent Cooper, Gilbert Sprauve, and Clement White's work, as well as online conversations with Biko McMillan and the scholarship of another young Virgin Islander, Amory Mathurin, who penned his thesis at UCLA on literature and cultural sovereignty in the US Virgin Islands. Tonight's discussion will meditate on a set of questions regarding language, freedom, and culture. Specifically, what is language and how can we as Virgin Islanders continue to make a case for recognizing Virgin Islands Creole and its legitimacy as a part of our freedom praxis, as well as asking tonight's panelists to meditate on a few questions. How does Virgin Islands Creole shape our political imaginaries and help us to remember our identities, histories, and hopes for the future, given our political status? In his book, Meet Me Under a Bongolo and Talk Like We Know, Dr. White cites Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o's statement, and I quote, "Language is the collective memory bank of a people's experience in history. Culture is indistinguishable from the language that makes its genesis, growth, banking, articulation, and indeed its transmission from one generation to the next." End quote. And so tonight, we will explore this nexus between language, culture, power, identity, and memory. And each panelist will provide their remarks. We will hear first from our senior scholars, and their remarks will be followed by that of Mr. Biko McMillan, who will speak on why and how he uses Virgin Islands Creole in his writing. We will then open to Q&A from the audience, so please feel free to post your questions on Facebook and or call us at 340-718-3339. Thank you, and I will then pass the mic to Dr. Gilbert Sprauve.
And thank you very much, Dr. So, if you don't mind, my calling you Hadiya from time to time. I know the family from many years, the family's deep roots on St. John, and I think it's very fitting that we have a program tonight that really represents the three Virgin Islands. Just speaking with Mr. Biko a while ago, we learned of his that he's Cochin, but also he's in the family of the famous Stanley in the Sleepless Nights. Also, that his people had their origins, at least on one part of the family, in Yakis. And of course, Dr. Clement White, one of our real shining stars. We've had him here back at the University of Berlin for a couple of important panels on having to do both with emancipation and issues about culture and literature and so on in the Virgin Islands. The late Jean Emanuel and I coordinated some of this activity. So we represent all three islands, and I think it's very fitting that St. JanCo is involved in promoting and putting forward this program through WTJX, our own local station. I believe the topic is a fitting one, and I would first point out that in terms of when we talk about Virgin Islands English Creole, which I believe we'll be concentrating on tonight, we're going to have to recognize that it's not a monolith, that Virgin Islands English Creole has its St. Thomas, St. John version. The two of them pretty much collapsed into one. The people from St. John and the people from particularly the northeastern and southeastern quadrant of St. Thomas pretty much spoke the same Creole in terms of features of the phonology and particularly the phonology. By phonology, I mean particularly the vowel and consonant system. The St. Croix has its own version. We kind of like to pull each other's, make fun of each other. Cushions like to tease us from the northern side of the lake about our here and there, and we like to tease them about their here and there. And sometimes we even extend the joke to our neighbors in Tortola, with whom many of us, again, I believe that Clement White shares a heritage there also, where they might say yeah and yeah, but we all understand each other. So I would sort of put that in the background as we start discussing the role. It's good to see a young man like Biko involved now in the creative use of the language. And of course, Dr. White has written some fantastic poetry besides his work in the language as a lexicographer. My writings, I'll talk about them a little later, have more to do with anecdotal sketches that I try to use to help us sort of lighten up and have a little fun with each other as a people, because sometimes there's a lot of tenseness in the culture. So on that, I'm going to yield to Dr. White, if he's ready to pick up the carry on for me.
Am I on? Am I okay?
Yes, you are.
Yes. Okay, first of all, I want to say good evening and thank you, Dr. So and the St. John Heritage Collective for this unique opportunity. I was looking forward to it. I'm so happy for all the assistance I received from Mr. Kyle Davis. Thank you for your patience. Mr. Biko McMillan, this is the first time I've met you, but I can tell you are a rising star. Dr. Gilbert Sprauve, friend, colleague, a pioneer and leader in this area, to whom I defer with respect to the evolution and the development of Virgin Islands Creole, and to the listening audience, locally and nationally, my sons, daughters-in-law, grandchildren, brothers, sisters, cousins, nieces, nephews. You know who I is. I don't call your name. Welcome. Recently, in a casual conversation, someone said to me, Centurions speak bad. With no regard to the irony embedded in such an utterance, you might assume that I would consider this to be both personally and culturally abrasive and repulsive, a kind of affront to my Virgin Islands identity. After all, if you say Centurions speak badly or Centurions speak badly, then you might also say that Prussians, if they speak differently, still speak badly. In other words, it seems like there should be some kind of response, some kind of acrimonious response, but that did not happen. Instead, how come you say that, man? Was my meek and gentle response. The individual making the assertion is someone who has lived in the Virgin Islands for many years, people whom we like to call outsiders, like being banned here. But there are at least two reasons why my reaction was so subdued. The first is that such moments indicate or suggest or show the gap that we need to fill in the process of educating our people, including ourselves, maybe especially ourselves, with respect to Virgin Islands Creole. I find such moments to be opportunistic, a teachable moment, as the former president would say. No, not that one. The former one to that one, President Obama. But certainly, resistant nature of the comment itself. Secondly, Why would I become flustered and frustrated by a comment that is equally prevalent in the community that we call native? I speak here now primarily of a kind of cultural linguistic patrol that monitors and has been monitoring for generations our speech and refers to our language with a ceaseless litany of despectives and pejoratives. They spew their venom, excuse me, but it's true, describing our Creole, for example, as crude and raw and backward and substandard and broken and vulgar and broad and corrupt. You sound so stupid. They banish our language to a perpetual gutter, that gutter language, from which, in their view, it can never emerge until we subscribe to their concocted notions of an Americanized mode of communication. You got to yank. Our Creole, in essence, has been subjected to the basis level of subalternity as it connotes a lack of education, undereducation, or miseducation according to the linguistic surveillance. Growing up, I thought that there was some kind of connection between the way I speak and morality. Don't speak like that on Sunday. Don't talk like that in church. A kind of linguistic heresy and blasphemy. But we should know that speaking our Creole should never be a barometer for morality. And then there are those who suck up the teeth. If you are bold enough, like we are doing this evening, to even use the term Virgin Islands Creole, or worse, if you're looking for blows, my son, Virgin Islands language. Our form of speech is reduced, according to them, to merely bad morphological and syntactic expressions. Your pronunciation and enunciation are embarrassing, atrocious, and your grammar surpasses that in its barbarity. Not surprisingly, though, our tendency to reject our Creole is not necessarily because we ourselves discern some abnormality in the way we speak, but rather at times because someone pushing an ideology has convinced us of the second-class nature of our language. Subverting prevailing negative interpretations and images of Virgin Islands Creole would be a major step in debunking the myth of language deficiency and subordination. But wait a minute, we're actually talking here about ideology. Ideology which is long, unforgiving tentacles. That's how it functions. It interpolates us. The French critic Louis Althusser gives us a definition. Ideology as, quote, the representation of the imaginary relationship of individuals to the real conditions of existence, end of quote. In other words, ideology has its material existence. It lives in, thrives in, survives in the apparatuses. Many of our people, we got to admit it, let's be honest here this evening, want to distance themselves from our mode of communication because this linguistic distancing gives them, a very important word, the illusion that they do not belong to the group of the miseducated, uneducated, and undereducation that they describe. But as Althusser has suggested, this is imaginary and misrepresentation, or as Engels or Marx would say, this is false consciousness. In my mind, there's always a detectable level of epistemic violence and rancor inherent in the rejection of our Creole as legitimate. Of course, there are many Americans as well who find our language to be revolting and despicable. Many of them consciously, or maybe subconsciously, distance themselves from this form of communication for fear of being associated with such a degenerate form of speech. So whether we are referring to the others that delegitimize our Creole or natives who do so, and sometimes with impunity, the fact is that this is due to an imposition of ideology of superiority or inferiority. With respect to the use of Creole, Frantz Fanon complained about a similar situation in Martinique and Guadeloupe, where people want to speak the perfect French, like we want to speak our perfect English also, but they are speaking the French, but they want to disassociate themselves from their local Creole. According to Fanon, and I quote, teachers keep a close watch over the children to make sure that they do not use Creole. While it may be true that we are generally proud of being Virgin Islanders, this expression of pride does not always extend to a mode of communication, a kind of cognitive dissonance. Or even in cases when we do identify and embrace our language, we do so with restrictions. For example, let's use Virgin Islands Creole in the backdrop, in the back rooms. And man, to all the party, them all the carnival, the festival, the bacchanal, the mamashe. But speaking of our language must not be a restrictive activity. Such an attitude reduces it to the level of the trivial and encourages a kind of, I would say, de facto ban on the way we speak, and ultimately promotes an attitude of resignation to the unwritten prohibitions. But you look no, as my dear mother used to say, this is no time for crocodile tears. There's nothing unique in this linguistic attack. Our ancestors who spoke Dutch Creole, often called by others Nederhollands, were seen as speaking a corrupt version of Zeelandic Dutch. So they went through much of the same thing. This new mode of articulation, emerging as it were in a crucible of competing nations, was also infused with various African languages, Portuguese, Spanish, reflecting the diversity of the new African diaspora as subject. That the language is orally extinct today does not preclude the fact that there are still remnants of it in the vocabulary, pronunciation, inflection, intonation, and popular saying endemic in contemporary Virgin Islands society. We are part of a natural, cultural, and linguistic legacy, a subset of our ancestors. As such, we cannot separate ourselves. I hope we don't try to. Thus, it is expected that echoes of words and songs of our predecessors will still resonate within us. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in his book, Decolonizing the Mind, offers this quote, that I love. I quote, "The choice of language and the use to which language is put is central to a people's definition of themselves in relationship to their natural and social environment, indeed in relationship to the entire universe." I believe that opening the gates for the use of Virgin Islands Creole, whether St. Croix Creole, St. Thomas Creole, St. Thomas and John Creole, in formal settings, the courts, the schools, the churches, would help to destigmatize this language, this rich language, a residue of the Dutch Creoles spoken by our ingenious and creative ancestors. In addition to this, maybe the formation of an academy that focuses on the language would lead us to the pathway of wider recognition and acceptance. I will end with an applicable quotation from the Center for Solidarity and Study of Antillean Guyanese and Reunion Islanders, an association committed to the eradication of Creole language in France and advocates for the official recognition of their Creole language. The organization's position is clear. Speaking Creole is a fundamental part of who we are. Our goal is to put an end to the subordination of Creole to other languages, including French, and to show that it can be used in all contexts. If in the United States Virgin Islands, we can arrive at this level of social, cultural, political, and linguistic consciousness, we will certainly begin a process of unseating long-held negative sentiments with respect to the Creole spoken in the territories of the Akwamu, Brefu, King June, Queen Mary, Bakambeli, Queen Kosaya, Boti, and all the rest of them. And we would well be on the way to authenticating our very precious Virgin Islands Creole. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. White. And next we have Mr. Biko McMillan.
All right. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for having me and allowing me to share the stage with such esteemed scholars such as yourselves. I am going to begin with a poem that I wrote in a presentation for the Sinclair Educational Complex High School. And it's entitled Navel String. 1. My navel string buried too deep in VI soil for anybody to ever find it. Born and raised on these 84 square miles, I know her secrets as well as I know mine. On a windy day at the beach, you might hear the breeze whisper in your ear, "Mind your foot, ega kashade." But as a young boy, sometimes I may be laughing too loud with my brother and my cousin, and my cousins, and my cousin who isn't my cousin, but you couldn't tell me they weren't my cousin to hear the warning. Songs of my youth play over and over like a broken record. We reach in, we reach in, we reach into the beach in, we reach, we reach, we reach to the beach, with our recording studio being the back of a truck that was probably illegal to ride in anyway, and still we had fun. I spent many of those days in my mother's purple and white house in Scion Farm, and at night on the porch we could see a skyline more toxic than we would ever know, a cloud machine, towers of economic freedom, towers of environmental bondage. On this porch, we would refine our memories, too. I hear had a riot between Elena and Woodson when they were doing double session. I hear had a partner gay head bust with a chain. I struggled with putting these lines in a poem I would read to high schoolers until I realized junior high schoolers lived them. As children, we know violence before we can spell it. We map cemeteries so we can find our loved ones laid to rest, like cartographers who did not wish to choose our trade. I could get 2 titi bread with some cheese and a bushie. I am tired of starting my mornings with grief. I am tired of having my breakfast with morning 3. What is more beautiful than a sunrise at Point Udall? What is more vibrant than the mountainside ablaze with Ginger Thomas flowers? Whose town is as rich with culture as Frederickstead? Only my dialect can accurately describe these things. La femme bad, a Chris. And no matter how dark paradise may seem for us at times, we bring light to it like only we can because we are forged in fire. We are Crucians. We are Virgin Islanders. So I wrote that poem while making the case for using spoken word as a new medium for oral tradition in the Virgin Islands. That poem really tells a piece of my story by just the words that I use, but even beyond the words that I use, how I use them is an important piece of my story. That concept of code switching, going back and forth between Standard English and Virgin Islands Creole, is important to me. It is a part of my being because I would spend many summers away, many summers coming back, and so I would have to kind of bob and weave through these languages, these dialects, in order to communicate. And this dialect being such an important part of my story, I think, as Dr. White was saying, we do ourselves a disservice whenever we refer to the language we speak as a broken English, because if this dialect, this language is so central to who we are, if it's tied to our most simple emotions, how many times have we said, you know, you don't want me to get vexed. If I get vexed, my accent will come out. That's tied to our anger. If we're super happy, you hear the dialect come out more. If our dialect is tied to these primitive emotions, these things that are so central to our being, what does that mean when we call it broken? Are we as people also broken? What happens when we say that there's no space for it in academia? Is there no space for Virgin Islanders in academia? We have proven here tonight that there is a lot of space and we thrive in academia. And so I wish I could say that it was just us, but throughout my Spanish degree, you know, I would hear a lot of people say, you know, that their Spanish is broken, especially if they speak Spanish from the Caribbean. I feel like we have a lot in common there as to the roots of who we are. And you see that a lot of times that a oppressive power comes to take over an area, one of the first things that they do is relinquish those people of the language they speak. I'm not saying that's what's happening here, but you know, but that's all I'll say for now, and I'll yield my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Biko and Dr. White, as well as Dr. Sprauve. I deeply appreciated having the opportunity to hear your thoughts on Virgin Islands Creole and also hear a bit more about how you incorporate Virgin Islands Creole in your literature, Biko in particular. One of the questions that I have for all of you is essentially a question around recognizing the legitimacy of Virgin Islands Creole and how essential it is to our freedom praxis as Virgin Islanders. And so to begin, I'll perhaps direct this question to Dr. White. And the question essentially is, for those who believe that Virgin Islands Creole is a corrupt or broken form of English, or that it is simply a dialect and not a complex, beautiful, and nuanced language, how would you explain the validity and the legitimacy of Virgin Islands Creole as a language to a skeptic?
I think that's a great question, and here is my position. I think sometimes we get so caught up in the distinction between language and dialects, and you know, in the long run, we're probably essentially speaking about the same thing. Here is where I run into problems. I have no objections in people speaking about our Creole, our Virgin Islands. I'm speaking about all Virgin Islands because even though St. Croix might sound differently, Grove might sound differently to Frederickstead. My family come from Frederickstead and Grove, And I can tell you, I can find the distinction. So even though that is true, it is true in the same way how in Madrid, Spain, you can hear all kind of different accents, but there's still a Madrilean accent. So my thing is, you have to educate the people. You have to explain to them that when you say things like we speak just a broken language or a broken version of English, then what you are doing is you are actually buying into the ideology that the language that you speak is corrupt. So to answer the question, I think the only way really to do it is through education, through constant representation of our language in programs, in literature, that does it, on stage, and all of these aspects. Because we are on a mission, at least I am, I know Dr. Sprauve, and I can now say that Biko is. We are on a mission to show people that there's no such thing as a bad language. Where I got upset is when people dismiss our language, oh, that's just a dialect. I was in the company of someone one time when someone asked a question. The person asked her, do you speak English in the US Virgin Islands? Her answer was, well, we speak English, but a broken kind of English. That's absolutely ridiculous. And this is where people get upset with me. You can speak your perfect French, you can speak your perfect Spanish, you can speak your perfect English. But like Fanon would say, there is a local form of expression that you should embrace in the same way. And the only way we can do it is to constantly peddle that ideology that our language is just as legitimate, no better, no worse. This isn't an argument for a language that is superior. And also just want to say one more thing, Dr. Sewer, and that is this. The thing that bothers me most about all of this is that very often, and I'm speaking about our local community, if Dr. Sprauve says, I want to talk to these young people about Virgin Islands Creole, what is the first reaction from those people who consider themselves guardians of culture? Oh, you're trying to move the kids away from speaking correct English. You're going to corrupt them. They'll never learn English. Listen to me. A person can learn Spanish and still know English. You can learn Portuguese and still know your Spanish. There is no contradiction between learning two different languages. So I see the way how we speak, and we can argue about this. I see it as a language. English is a lexifier, of course. But if I say, for example, that's a footman gea bon conco, and he walking like gea bamaku, I can say that as slowly as I want. There is no American who will understand that statement. So don't tell me that we only speak English. We, like those before us, with Nega Hollands, Dutch Creole, they were using all kinds of words. I saw words like cabrita, which is words from Spanish. I see our language as being a very versatile language, creative language. And the way to do it is through our literature and through constant education, like the academy that I mentioned.
Thank you, Dr. White. I think that's such a wonderful response for so many reasons. In part, I feel like you really help us to understand that, in part, our understanding of Virgin Islands Creole as an inferior language is socially and politically constructed, that it's something that we learn through the colonial order and all of the processes by which we might have internalized that colonization, and therefore the recognition of the legitimacy of Virgin Islands Creole is a process by which we are really unlearning the false consciousness that you mentioned earlier and finding and charting new ways of being in the world that are dismantling and pushing back against this notion of our inferiority as people who are colonized, Caribbean, primarily people of color, and so on. One of the questions that I actually have for all of you is a question about the arts. You each use Virgin Islands Creole in various art forms, whether that be literature and or song and or, you know, the various plays that Virgin Islanders participate in. And one of the things that I find most notable about this is essentially that when we commemorate Queen Mary, for example, or when we think of the freedom fighters of of 1848, we don't often transmit this knowledge about our history in, standard American English. We often ask Queen Mary, where you are going to born? And then we may also say, clear the road, let us slave them pass, we come in for our freedom. And so I think that there's something very critical about the way that we deploy Virgin Islands Creole to facilitate remembering those who have really fought for freedom in the then Danish West Indies, now US Virgin Islands. And in some ways, the way we speak back to the current colonial order. And so I'm wondering if you all might say a bit more about your creative practice and why it's important to continue to use Virgin Islands Creole in your creative practice, as well as what you think it may unlock in the way that you think about freedom and develop your political imaginaries. Dr. Sprauve?
Yeah, and I want to recognize the brilliance of the presentation so far, Biko and Dr. White, and really being able to encapsulate what is really not just a Caribbean problem, but there's so many things involved here in terms of class and caste, and it goes global, right? And I want to go back to what you said, that Hadiya, again, I'm permitted to just address your first name, right? And recognize your academic achievements and everything. But you remember what got you moved to start getting interested in the Creole. We were on stage in St. John for Emancipation Day, which has been coming under the wings of July 4th, year after year. And the people that make the political decisions decided, well, we give St. John something. St. Thomas a carnival, St. Croix got Christmas and whatnot. And so St. John get them 4th of July. And, and I'm sure, Valdemar Hill was around, it is clear the road and his sons and whatnot, in terms of awareness that before 4th of July, it had to have a July 3rd Emancipation Day of its importance. And the fact that we were, and the community came out and supported us. And I'm a little worried that with the COVID and everything this year, we run the risk of it falling back into under the wings of 4th of July. We pulled it out. We got rehearsals going with the community, people on St. John. If you start calling names, then you're going to leave people out. But we manufactured that in St. John in terms of a script that was to some extent, and we've been doing it for several years before, trying to tie in 1733 and St. John, which is significant, not just for St. John and the Virgin Islands, but the Caribbean and people all over the world of what took place in November in 1733. And so we tied that into 1848 with some ideas, and taking some liberties that there had to be in the memory of our people, the freedom fighting spirit, that when 1733 was over, it was not really all over. And that 1848, there would be people who would know what took place in St. John more than 100 years before. And that would help to drive. And the people, some of us quibble about this. Some people are historians and say, no, Sprauve didn't make up all kind of story. Who could tell you that for sure such and such happened, right? But the thing is, the spirit was there to put on stage, to rehearse, create our own play, bring it on stage, and more and more people were coming from St. Thomas. We had to put out tents and whatnot. And at a crucial point, we needed somebody to be the Millie woman, as you said. And somebody said, look, Hadiya, she look like she got talent. And just one little line was all she had. And it electrified the crowd, the way she delivered it. But she came and she brought a couple of other people with her of her generation, which is part of this St. John, right? Mr. Marsh and Mr. Penn, the three of them, they're the new generation. We sort of about it all. But I'm saying that put in, and I agree with everything Clement has said, Dr. White. But since the question is, what are we doing as, besides being in a classroom, being academicians and whatnot, or going, and just going on tours and reading your poetry, which Biko will probably be doing sometime. The point is when you can use it right here to energize our people. And this is basically, and people get very disturbed, people who don't want to hear it, because kids all over the Caribbean been having to look out for the little pimp in the schoolyard, whose assignment was what we call it today, brown nosing, because he's the one that will come back to the teacher and say, you know what, because they're talking like them people down there in the yard and whatnot under the tree, and then Biko gets punished for it, because that's what was happening up and down the Caribbean. I went down to Dominica and St. Lucia to get my groundings in Dominican St. Lucian Creole, and that's the kind of thing I was getting from educators, their own experience of having to really suppress the language because you had language patrols in the schools, listening to who was speaking patois, right? And we have had it in these Virgin Islands, and we got to face to it. Clement, we got to face up to it. My mother would say to me every so often, she got a little exasperated, but you with this guy, with that kind of broad talk, you come back from a degree in Princeton and you could be, and I have to say, you listen to the speeches of John Kennedy, that broad that you're talking about in the yard and the Boston yard, it's right in the United States in particular dialects. And this business about which is the proper English, I think many Americans themselves are so damn confused about it. I think they themselves have this inferiority complex, which they dump on us because unless you sound like the King's English that is speaking in England, a lot of Americans who come down and say they're teaching us English, they themselves got it hanging behind it and harassing them that they don't speak proper English themselves. That's so-called proper English. So as Clement is saying, if we get that whole idea about what is proper, and the same Biko is saying also, and you guys are using it in a way that I'm really very, very pleased as the elder one here. I'm really pleased to see what it is you all are doing to bring it forward and keep it alive. I think I probably said too much, but I needed to do my little, get up on my soapbox. And I want to thank all those people who have been able to put together Pan-African Workshop people, the people in St. John, their own little, cultural group, and in St. Croix, the group involved, including Mr. Mario Moed and that group, St. Brian, that have tried to keep this thing alive. Because what's coming down now, particularly in these times, the kind of extreme behavior that we see in terms of cultural, and the attack on critical race theory and whatnot, it says that unless we really firm up and understand what it is, and they can say what time it is, because that's the time what it is right now. We've got to, encourage and strengthen our folks in terms of their cultural identity. That's my spiel.
Dr. Sprauve, I know that we have a question from the audience that was posted on Facebook that I'd like to go ahead and share with you. And so this comment comes from Anse, and the question is, what was the distinction between the Creole language spoken in the N and S portions of St. Thomas compared to the east and eastern ends of the island? And did class play a role in the difference?
Okay, right on St. Thomas, the question is about one part of the island versus another?
Yes, it
The,
is.
the best information I can give on that is that in my earliest work, when I was trying to put the Dutch Creole, identify Dutch Creole informants, I was able to find that one of the families that some people would know well because they're connected between St. Thomas and St. John, the Fredericks family, of whom the doc in Red Hook is named, the Erman Frederick and the ball field out in Illinois, their father was an old man called Charlie Fredericks. He rode a donkey long when everybody else was done with mules and donkeys and whatnot. He was could be seen on the roadside, on the way into town. And he was one of the people I was able to get some of the remnants of Dutch Creole that could be still spoken. He and his wife spoke it, and he spoke it with a particular, and he told me, I speak Creole, Dutch Creole this way, but the people from down the street speak it different because they have a certain kind of way of dragging the vowels out. And these are some of the little things that, dialectal variants that you get. But he was able to demonstrate to me in Dutch Creole already. And I would imagine that he was from the southeastern part of the island, and so he spoke both English and Dutch Creole, and therefore there was probably a characteristic that carried over in the English Creole that he spoke, that one could say, I want from down the street, and I want from St. John. And that's about it, but they understood each other.
Thank you for sharing that history with us. I see that I actually have a question for Biko, and perhaps it's a question for both of us, but essentially my question to you is how you understand our generation's acceptance or lack thereof of Virgin Islands Creole. What work do you think that we might have to continue to do to recognize the legitimacy of our language?
Sure. So I think with our generation, I am seeing a lot of us communicate on social media in very raw versions of our dialect. And it seems to me to be like a relatively new thing. And I think that our generation is really understanding the kind of respectability politics that plays into not using our dialect in certain contexts. And whether it be consciously or not, we're doing what we can to undo it. I think the works that we can do to kind of further that would be sort of what Dr. White and Dr. Sprauve was saying, which is start explaining why this is a language or a dialect in and of itself that's not broken English. I hate to have to harp on that, but it's such an important piece to this. One litmus test you could have is if you saying, are you guys going to the store? You would never hear one of us say, you are going to the store, because that R following ayo doesn't fit grammatically. And if this was just a language that was thrown together, like is implied when we say it's just broken English, it wouldn't have that kind of grammatical structure. And so really just doing the work to kind of educate more. But I think our generation is doing a really good job of unlearning some of the harms that were taught to our parents and their parents.
Yeah, Biko, thank you so much for that. Also, what I really loved in your response also was the way in which you pointed us to the question of grammatical structure and also consensus, because I think that for many people who often view Virgin Islands Creole as simply being a broken form of English, they don't necessarily often recognize the degree to which there is there are indeed grammatical rules for our language. And so in our learning, I think, a bit more clearly what those grammatical rules are and being able to explain that in a way that fosters consensus, I think that you're absolutely right, that we'll begin to move towards a space where our advocacy for Virgin Islands Creole is a bit more clear. And so I really appreciate your discussion of the importance of a litmus test. And so another question that I actually have for all of us was essentially a more personal question of when did we each individually start to challenge some of the respectability politics that often advocates for shunning Virgin Islands Creole in favor of standard American English, and to speak a bit more about how we might have individually pushed back against that in both personal and professional contexts. One of the things that I want to say that I feel like my mother was often a person in my life who advocated very strongly for Virgin Islands Creole. And when I spoke standard American English, often, reminded me that, hey, we have a language as Virgin Islanders. And while, it's wonderful that you're using standard English in like academic context, don't forget we have a language and we can code switch and or use multiple or speak multiple languages in a way without having to degrade or create a hierarchy between one or the other. And so when I penned my senior thesis on the constitutional conventions at Spelman, I included Virgin Islands Creole in my title of my senior thesis. And then also often when I teach, even when I teach on the US mainland, whether it was as a TA at Brown University or as a research fellow at Stanford, I often, speak Virgin Islands Creole in the classroom. And so throughout the course of like the academic year, students might start to learn that, my professor, Dr. Sewer, says ayo, and this is what ayo means, is Virgin Islands Creole. And I felt like that was particularly important, one, because it allowed me to increase my own comfortability in the space. But two, I think it helped to lessen some of the hierarchies that exist around language by normalizing my communication in Virgin Islands Creole in both professional and personal contexts. And so I'm curious about whether you all had any specific light bulb moments that you'd like to share with us, or if you have any, recommendations or observations of things that you or something that loved ones may have done and or said that really helped you to think about the importance of our language and how you would like to use it a bit differently.
And at the risk of probably causing little issues in the family, my children, there are four of them, and each one of them is completely comfortable in the language of the folk of the Virgin Islands. Three of them are all four, they're really professionals in their own right, and including, very, very good education. And I believe that they are totally comfortable in speaking Creole with the people that they deal with every day without any yanking. They know when they can code switch, when it's practical to code switch, but they have absolutely no hang-up in using the Virgin Islands Creole that they learned at the cradle. And a lot of it has to do with, and that's why I mentioned the situation I'm saying, even with my mother, I've had to deal with it. Because we can't ignore the fact that there's a lot of ambivalence. Ambivalence is part of Creole life. And nowadays that everybody's into gig culture, where you just do what you have to do to get what you need, what you want, we can expect that it's going to be even more resilient of a lot of switching. People, I mean, the word I heard last night about what happened in Haiti. That might sound like that has nothing to do with this, but didn't you? I'm sure somebody has heard that there's a suspicion that somebody was speaking American English and somebody was speaking Spanish. So people are doing what they have to do to send the different messages, and we've just got to say, first of all, we got to deal with the reality of what has happened right here among us with people we love, we close to and whatnot, but a lot of them don't really subscribe to what we are here saying tonight about the validity of our language and how important it is to our culture and our identity. That's a fact of life up and down the Caribbean.
And
rejoined us, and so I'm wondering if you would like to make a closing remark on the relationship between language and power and freedom.
Kicked off the internet, I guess Elsa is coming up this way. Yeah,
it is. Okay.
One of the things that I love about people like Dr. Sprauve and Robin Sabino is the efforts that they have made, for example, to go back, especially Dr. Sprauve, to go back and learn Virgin Islands Dutch Creole. I'm struggling with that language right now. I'm trying to learn more about it. But for me, the thing I'll say is, when we think in terms of language, usually it's a hegemonic structure that determines what a language is. It's the ruling class, the ruling power. What happens with us is, because we are still colonized, yes, we're United States territory, but what does that mean? We can't vote for president of the United States if we live in the Virgin Islands. So therefore, no one will want to authenticate our form of speaking, because the first thing people are going to say is, it is bad English.
Right.
You're teaching the children them stupidness. Let the children learn as if there's some kind of contradiction. I think our power would come and our freedom will come from insisting on that legacy that came from before. The people that suffered in 1733 and in 1848, and the people that suffered in 1892, Kosaya. Okay, all of those people, we have to honor them by honoring the fact that these people were speaking a different kind of language that we are speaking now. So I think embracing that, recognizing it, and seeing it as part of our cherished legacy, there's no shame in that.
Right. Thank you, Dr. White, for making such a strong closing remark and reminding us to honor our heroes. And also thank you, Dr. Sprauve and Mr. McMillan, for joining us. And we are at the end of our segment, though of course we could have continued talking for much longer. In closing, I would like to also thank the Friends of the Virgin Islands National Park, my fellow team members at St. JanCo, and the team here at WTJX. I appreciate all of you who took the time this evening to join us for this conversation about language, freedom, power, and identity in the U.S. Virgin Islands. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.